Hello, class recording started. I will upload this later. For future you. Future me says you're welcome. So here's the log. I've got a log camera. So inside of, whenever you make a camera, which is very easy, you just go to add camera, and then it makes a camera. So actually, why don't we, it'll probably be more interesting if I do it with the wood scene. So let me make a new camera, just so I can demonstrate. This is what my camera looks like. Same process in Maya as well. You just make a camera, and then we can name it. Call it render cam, and some of these I gave it different names. I called it like Woods bottom, Woods top, depending on what camera angle we had. You can rotate that around as you will. There's different ways you can move the camera. So up at the top there is global, which is just like kind of that north, south, east, west. So I can rotate that, I can move that. There's local, which is really, really useful for moving the camera because it is just the objects up, down, left, right. So if I just want to move left and right based on where the camera is, local is pretty cool. You can do it by the view, and then no matter where I move my viewport camera, it'll always be pointing toward that. So that's kind of fun. You can also move it around the 3D cursor, however that's oriented. I'll keep it on, I'll put on local for now. So in order to set this to your scene, you can right click and set as the active camera. You can see this view over here changed to that. This is just another 3D viewport, but when you hit camera, it goes into there. So now I can use this view. Well, there we go. So now I can rotate this freely around. There we go. You can see I can move him like that and get this camera roughly in place. So with our wood scene, the way I lined it up is in your camera, this little camera option, you can set the focal length. You can see how that affects that over here, just like a real camera. So if we're using a wide lens, we can match it up to that. So we could, you can do like a fisheye lens, it can get really extreme, or you can do a very narrow lens. You can see it's stretching the camera there. We know that we used a 55mm lens. If you were paying attention on location, you will also know that we put the camera on this rock. So I actually just used that as where I would put my camera. You can see both of them kind of right here are just poised over that rock. So if you know where your camera was, if you took measurements, then you can match it up pretty close. So already we're roughly in the right spot. We got the log in front. If you want to have the footage of your camera, you can add a background image to your camera. And you can either add an image or a movie. So I can say, I want to open this. I want to grab my footage. And maybe we want the log over footage to have the log there. Now it's open. You can't see anything now because it is set to be in the back. If I set it to the front, it is now in front of everything, and I can overlay this image on top. Pretty cool. So first step is just to get it kind of roughly in place and kind of match that log up. So because I did this before, I can go a little bit faster. It does take some time. It does take a lot of practice. So I can kind of get it right in here. Move that up. And that's looking closer. So you can get the exact camera view, because this is the footage we're going to be putting our character on top of. And this is where we're going to be animating the character. So when we match it up, it'll be exactly where it was. Another little trick that I sometimes will do is I've got this guy here. Actually, yeah, I'll do it this way. I can add something like an empty, which is just a little invisible object. You can see it here in the camera. And I'm actually going to move it kind of close to the camera. Maybe scale it down a little bit. I can use these as kind of little tracking points on my footage to kind of help line it up. So if I say, let's look at this knot here, and then let's look at maybe that knot over there, I can make copy paste and then move it here. And then I can select both of those, select my camera as the active object, and just parent it. Then when I move my camera, it should move everything with it. Which means when I take the opacity down, now I've got little tracking markers that I can line up on my digital log. I went to the add menu and I just made a little empty object. There's a bunch of different types if you want an arrow, if you want a sphere or a cone. I just like the plain axis because it's like a little crosshair and I'm just looking at the center. And you can get it lined up perfectly. Because I know that in my footage, this lines up exactly on that knot, that lines up exactly on that knot. So when I'm adjusting this, I can get it pretty close to what I need, right? Looks like we're a little too close here because these dots are in between here. So I can go to my top view and kind of pull back a little bit until they're aligned over where I want and adjust them from there. So I'm not going to go through the whole process because I've already done this once in this scene. So I'm going to delete that camera. And I can just show you this one that I already set up. Set that as my active camera. There we go. So with this one, exact same setup. And you can see my little tracking markers in here that I put in. It's probably easier if I do this. Show you just the material. So you can see my little crosshairs that I gave for myself. There's this log in the back. There's a couple prominent knots on the log at different points. And I just kept adjusting the camera until all of those points were matching up exactly on my footage. So this file is yours. It is on Canvas. And you can import that in. The camera's already in there. It might need a little bit of adjusting, but I think it's pretty close. But let me open up my character file, because I also prepped that. Here's my little mush man. Mush man on a log. And here's my scene. So the way that I imported this is by just going to File and Append, because we can attach another Blender file, right? So I can go in to my, my camera angles, and I've separated all of them into different collections. So whichever scene you want to import in, if you want to use the wood scene, if you want to use the log, if you want to use the bridge, you can just append that collection to it. On Canvas, it's called camera angles.blend. So you can see I've got my little scene down here. You'll notice, though, that it is not to scale with my character that I made. So the way that I scale my environment up without messing up my camera is... There we go, object mode. This guy. Get that open. Yeah. Here's my bridge down here. Let me hide the woods for now. Let's say I want to use my bridge scan and I want to scale it up. I can make an empty, it could be anything, it doesn't need to be a circle. Just something to scale with, and then I can grab my bridge, I can grab my camera. I've got a little camera aim thing in there too, and then I can grab my just select a box over all that. There we go. Selecting this last, and then just parent it, Control P. Then if I scale this, it just scales everything with it. In Maya, it's really easy too. You can just put the whole thing into a group and just scale the group. Maybe that's the scale I want for my mush man to go on that bridge. And that's in place. So let me delete this bridge so I can go back to my woods. So I did the exact same thing there, and then I just posed my character on top of that log. It's important to note, though, for the shadow catcher, because again, we're not going to be using the actual texture on this. We're going to be using this to catch the shadows. We actually probably won't need the whole environment to do that. We really just need wherever the character is interacting with, and that'll save us on some render time as well. So if you don't need sections of this, so I really just need the log, right? So I can actually just go into here and delete some faces. I'll go into do this with X-ray on so I can get it cleanly. There we go. Question?
How do we get that window to the left?
So it shows the camera over there. Any window in Blender can be split, so you can see I'm hovering between here. And I can do a vertical split or a horizontal split. So if I do a vertical split, you can see it's I can determine where that is. And then what's cool about Blender is that every single window in Blender is exactly the same. This can be anything. If I want this to be a graph editor, it can be a graph editor. If I want this to be a 3D viewport or a UV editor, I can do that. If I want this to be a Python scripting control, I can do that. And if you want to get rid of any of them, you can hover between and join areas. So I can join this to that, or vice versa. So I just split this and made it into another 3D viewport.
And then how do I get that?
I'll hop back over to here and take a look at it in the camera. That looks pretty good. I can even go into the camera here and say I don't need any of those. Delete all those faces if I don't need any of these. So I'm really just looking for that log to cast a shadow on. I don't really need to affect anything else in my footage. And because our footage doesn't even move, it really just matters what's in the camera. So that's really all I need for any of this. So that'll work nice. To get this to catch shadows, two things. One, we're going to go to our render settings and change it to cycles, because cycles just is going to look better than Eevee. If we had better GPUs, I would say we could use Eevee, but cycle should be good. And then if your object selected, you can go to your object properties, which is that orange box. It's normally where we move things around. Oh, yes it is. Thank you. I thought it was there. So yeah, go down to visibility, and under mask there is one called I just couldn't read it because it wasn't expanded. Yeah, shadow catcher. So when I look at this, I'll show you in the render view. Here's what it looks like normally. And when I turn on shadow catcher under visibility, it is now seemingly invisible, but there actually is some shadows here. You can see that dark spot over here. So it is catching shadows from the diffuse light around. So under visibility, under mask, it's called shadow catcher. So now your log is set up. We went over the environment a little bit yesterday, but I'll review it again. For the background, you want to be in the shading tab. And then instead of applying it to an object, we're applying it to the world. So we have our background. And then plugged into that is an environment texture. So you can find that under Add Texture, Environment Texture. And we just plugged I just plugged my HDRI into there. If you need to move it around, you can also attach a mapping node and a texture coordinate node to it. These are pretty common nodes for Blender texture system. But if I need to rotate the image around, I can do that. Right now it's transparent, and I'll show you why that is. Just a second. So that's in my render properties. So you can see in here, this is my image. There's us. Beautiful. But if I need to rotate my HDRI, then I can. So I can rotate us over there. So I just made it so that whatever direction the log was facing, that behind it was the thing that was actually behind it, because we want the sky over here to be casting our light onto our character. If your if it looks too dark, so this is what it originally looked like, you can just adjust the strength on the background where you plug it in. So I just bumped it up to 5. I was just going off of the footage that I had, and that seemed about the right amount of light for the scene, because it is diffuse lighting in the forest. It wasn't a super duper like bright day. Like once we were under the canopy, it was pretty shaded in there.
And what do you have behind the purchaser?
Back here? Yeah, I've got a mapping. So mapping just gives it coordinates. So you can tell it to go up, down, left, right, rotate, or scale, and then a texture coordinate. So you're basically telling it, I have a texture. That texture has coordinates. It applies to this texture, and that goes into my background. So that's what the flow of the nodes mean. And then that background is going into the surface of my world back here. So if I rendered this now, it would actually have that image in the background, but you can actually go into your render settings, your render properties, and just tell it to have a transparent background, which is what we want. What's cool about the shadow catcher in here as well is, see on top here, I've got a little bit of shading under him, that little bit of shadow. If I rotate underneath, it actually masks him off. So you can see that log. So it's already doing a lot of work for me, which I think is pretty cool. Everybody save. Oh, there we go. Yeah, good opportunity to save. If it does crash on you, remember also that Blender does autosave. So when you reopen Blender, you can go up to File and Recover and look in your autosaves. I've had a very good history with Blender recovering my work in that category. So there we go. He's all set up for animation. For render settings, these two tabs, we want our render properties. So in Blender, we've got our viewport and then our actual render. So remember, it's just a matter of samples. The more samples you have, the better it will look, but the longer it will take per frame. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just set a very high sample rate and then give it a time limit. So you can set how long you want each frame to render. So if you want to do like 5 minutes for each frame, I think that will be adequate enough. Then you would know exactly how long your animation is going to take to render. This little button down here is a lifesaver. Denoise is so good. So let's just do a little 3-minute render, and I'll set that in motion.
So could you repeat that, like, why, like, what a render of, like, 1 second versus 3 minutes would
Yeah, why don't I just show you what a short render does?
okay.
Let's do a 20-second render.
Okay.
So we'll see how many samples it gets through, and we'll just render an image. There's my guy. And you can see I've set my sample rate to be pretty high. It's not going to get through that many because I set a time limit on it. But it has my timer count down there. And denoise will help a little bit, because it'll take some of this grain and kind of try to smooth it out. It's best to render as long as you can, so it'll just look better in the end. Okay. So there's a 20-second render. It's not too bad, but the way it's blended a lot of this grain together, it's kind of like fuzzied it out more than I would like. Also down here with the shadow, it's not quite as clean as I might like to see. With his little beady eyes. So it also probably won't take that long to render because I'm not rendering an environment, right? I'm just rendering a character with a shadow under him. So it really only has to focus on this part. So you might be able to get away with a shorter render time. Let me do like a 3-minute one like I was originally intending. I'll just have that go in the background. So I'll set this off to the side for now and talk about the render settings while that goes. So denoise is really nice. You saw how much it actually smoothed all that grain out at the very, very end. Awesome setting to check on. Other things of note in this panel down below, the output properties. This is really important for your scene. You tell it how big you want it. 19 by 1080 is totally fine. 24 FPS is fine. We want to have the start and end of our animation. So if you're rendering all this in the same scene, let's say it was 10 seconds long, like this is. Then you could set that there. But if you split it up on multiple machines, you could say 1 to 50, and it would do that range. For output, you want to tell it where you want to save your files. That's important. Because if you don't, it'll just go into this temp folder, which you can't even find on Macs. So I can just put it on the desktop. And I could go and make a folder. Let's make a new folder. Mushman frames. And let's say I want it in that folder. And for us, we're going to be rendering this as an image sequence because it's going to be a lot better for you if it crashes and cleaner to import into other scenes. So we want a PNG because that'll have transparency in it as well. Compression, I probably don't want too much compression. Color management should be fine. But you can render this out as videos as well. The reason I do image sequences is because, again, if this crashes, I will still have every single frame that it rendered so far, whereas if I was rendering a video and it crashes, you lose everything. It's all or nothing. So we're going to do that. Now that I've saved it, then when I hit render animation, it'll just go through all of my frames and render out a PNG for every single frame. All right, my Mushman is almost done off to the side here. There he is. So there's a little bit more detail in there because I did put a kind of a bumpy texture on him. I can see it a little bit better. Again, at this scale, it's not going to matter quite as much. My shadow is a little bit smoother. It's not quite as grainy down there. But again, I might not even needed 3 minutes on this guy because the difference is fairly minimal. I could probably get away with like 2.5. So it's a balance. It's a balance of how much can you get away with, how much do you want to put in. But now I've got my little Mushman. And I'm going to save him out. I'll put him in Mushman frames. So I'm not going to animate him right this second because I do want to show you once you have animated it how to put it back together into your scene with the footage that we have. Which I think is on canvas. If not, it will be there. But it's the same footage that I put into my camera. Just let me I will import my footage, and I will import my little guy. Import file. There we go. And I will make a new comp from my selection. There's my guy. And then we will go and grab our file from our desktop with our Mushman. So when you're importing your frames that are rendered, you'll have a whole list of them. You just have to select the first one, and then you can hit PNG sequence, and it'll grab all the rest of them. So for now, I'm just gonna grab my one. And put him on top. Look at that! No work whatsoever.
Oh my gosh.
He's standing there. So with very little work, he's already in there. Now, I did do some color correction on this, so I can do some color correction on him as well. So over in effects, there's actually some color stuff that we can play with. There's a whole color correction category. Let's try maybe a color balance. So I could try boosting the reds a little bit, because I kind of boosted the red a little bit in there. So he's a little bit more vibrant now. And that's not too bad. So if you had your sequence, you'd be able to see him playing. If you need to change the frame rate of whatever you imported, because I think by default it's 29.97, you can interpret the footage of anything that you import in. So for your Mushman, you could say I want it to be at 24 FPS, or if you want to do it at 29 FPS. If you wanted to animate it at like 30 FPS, that would actually match your footage. But it'll be fine if it doesn't match exactly. But I can do a little bit of color correction on him, and then he will play through exactly on top of that little log. And you can see he does have a little bit of a shadow here, right in that area. So he does exist in the scene. It's very subtle, but with diffuse lighting, it is important to have that be in there. I might also do like a brightness and contrast on him, just to kind of a neat trick you can also do for your footage is if you put a black and white filter on both of them. Ask yourself if they match. Another trick I do for contrast is this exposure setting here. If I blow it out, you should see the background disappear first, and then the next layer of background. So this is disappearing now. As I increase it, the next thing is disappearing. So he should still be, his brightest point should be disappearing with the log's brightest points, which I think it is. I think that's pretty close. His darkest points should be disappearing with the log's darkest points, which it pretty much is. The log's a little bit closer than he is, and he's still got a little bit up there. Obviously his eyes are black, so that's a kind of an exception. But I could set that back to 0. I could take the black and white filter off. Yeah, that's just a little trick I do for compositing to make sure that they fit into the scene. And there he is. With So I'm basically just adjusting color. I'm not really having to like move him into this at all, because once the camera's matched up, you should just be able to drag and drop this onto whatever scene you have.
So we're rendering just our sprite with the shadow, and it has a transparent background for importing to the video from over.
Yeah. So this video is gonna be our backdrop, and we are putting a character on top of that. We took the scan so that we could get an accurate shadow cast on top of the objects that they interact with. It's a lot of work to put a character into a scene, right? So anytime you see Christmas Chronicles on Netflix with all the creepy little elves running around, you'll know all the work that they went through to make sure that they fit into that scene. Then for exporting, I'm just gonna go to, I'll bring it to the encoder queue. So for exporting, you just want to make sure that it's on H.264. You want to match the source and then tell it where you want to export to. I'll just put it on the desktop for now. Mushman, composite. That's this process that we're doing, is compositing, that final step of putting everything together. Render them out. There it goes. Yada da. Here's what I'll say for the brightness of your HDRIs for your lighting is it's much easier in post to make something brighter than it is to make it darker if it's overblown. So get it as close as you can to the footage and try not to go too far over, because you can always brighten it up. So here's my video of my Mushman. Look at that Mushman.
Yeah.
Alright. Let me open up the Blender, or not the Blender, let me open up the Maya file for you as well. Okay. So I did the exact same thing in these Maya files for you. I just have the camera set up. The process of setting this up with the camera is exactly the same. I just make a camera and then I import my mesh, and then in my camera what I did was I added an image file. So just like how we import reference images into here, if I set this view to be my render cam, or in this case my bridge camera, you can also import reference images into your camera. So I imported an image plane into here, and you can see what that looks like. So same exact process. And then I lined it up so it's ready to go. If I have my character in there, I'd put my character there. If you need to scale this up, I can grab both of these and group them. And then if I scale the group, oop, grab this group. So if you scale the group, it'll scale everything with it. So you can see in the camera, nothing is changing. The grid is just getting smaller. Or if you need to move it up, if you want the grid to be out of the way, then I can move it up or down. And I'm just moving it by the group. If you want to lock your camera in place, you can actually do that. I can select my camera here, and then up in my channel box where I have all this information of where it is, I can select all of that and then right click and lock selected. So now there is absolutely no chance of me moving that camera. You can see if I scroll my mouse over here, it doesn't do anything either. So you can lock the camera in place. it would be pretty much the same thing. For the material, there's actually an Arnold material. So just like we do our AI standard surface, so there's Arnold shader, there's ambient occlusion, there's the standard surface. There's also one called AI shadow matte, which doesn't look like anything, but it does exactly the same thing as the shadow catcher in the other program. So I can select this and then assign a shadow matte material to it. And right now it's completely grayed out, which is fine. But when I render, it'll have just a shadow. So let me just put a sphere in here for now. And then I'll add my Arnold sky dome. For the color, I want a file. Which file do I want?
Scroll over so you can see this. Yeah. Good one.
Open that up so you can see my background in there. I can even turn on the preview lighting so you can see what that'll look like.
That's where the cutoff.
Get this guy. If it's a bit dark, I can go into my settings and turn the intensity up so you can see that my sphere is getting brighter now. So that's about the brightness that it was. If you don't want to have your sky dome as your background, same menu, same area where we're adjusting the intensity. You can actually turn the visibility off in the camera. And then if I go to render,
Who gives? Who hurt?
I'm gonna go to render my bridge cam. We'll do a test render here.
Yeah. Or just one across the bottom. And then it kind of wraps around the bottom piece, I believe, and then goes in
There we go. Oop, forgot to turn off my my reference footage. Let me grab my camera. If I go to my panels and go to my bridge cam and select it, can I just... Oh, I can't just delete it. Let's try that. Yeah, there we go. So you can't see anything because the background is completely black and it has shadows, but it is rendering just that. So I just had to delete my reference image that I put in. So I save this. Hey, look at that, it auto-saved. So in the render settings, for Maya specifically, we have had some trouble in the past with having the PNGs having proper transparency when you do an image sequence. If the PNG doesn't work for you, you can also do a TIFF, and that works just as well. So whichever one gives you the actual transparency in the background. And then for the naming convention, instead of a single frame, just set it to anything besides single frame. So you just do name, number, extension. You can set the frame range, however long your animation is when you animate your character. You can set the size. We want to do 1920 by 1080. So standard HD, HD 1080. And again, you're familiar with these sliders from our first project, so play around with those, figure out what you need in your scene. Don't do any more than you need. Camera AA is just the general quality. Diffuse is for just general material, how that looks. Specular is the shine. Transmission is transparency. Subsurface, and then volume. Those probably don't need to be as high.
Yeah, like in between the two separate leaves and then like that through the scene.
And then we can render that out. If you're rendering a sequence, set where you want it to render to in your settings. Under common, you can see here, it'll tell me where it's going to put it. It should put it in your Maya project if you set your project. That's the best place for it to go.
Probably just on the back one.
And then this little guy right here, that little S, kind of a clapboard with some frames next to it. That's to render the sequence. It'll render sequentially every single frame in your sequence. And you'll have yourself an animation.
Yeah.
And from there, compositing it is exactly the same process. You import your frames into After Effects, put it on top of your footage, and bring it out again.